Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you very much, everyone, for setting the scene of the workshop today. I'm very happy to see how many people joined us today that share our enthusiasm and also that join us on this quest of what it is to do good research and doing good with research. We all know that there's an increased focus on transdisciplinary and also on transformative forms of research to address the ecological unsustainabilities, but also the social injustices that our societies are facing. And then in doing so, we are going back actually to the family of approaches that has been existed already for decades. And they have only been at the margins of our society, of our academic systems, actually, but only recently they have also increased in popularity, coming also with new questions on how to institutionalize them, how they fit within our universities, within our academic system, but also they invite this reflection on the normative underpinnings of this kind of research, and that's exactly why we're here today. And I'm very happy that in today's dialogue we have Dr. Katharina Bauer, who's Associate Professor of Practical Philosophy at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and Dr. Stefan Partelov, who is Professor of Environmental Governance at the, and I need to check, Center for Life Ethics at the University of Bonn in Germany. So I'm very happy to have you two here and to join us in what Stefan and his co-authors basically invited us to do, and to engage in ethical dialogue and critical reflection on those normative underpinnings. And today we're going to be starting with just the basics. You know, what is research ethics? So why does it matter for transformative and transdisciplinary research, before we go much more into some of the philosophical foundations that can help us guide us in taking decisions, in orienting us in with our questions. So I would like to start straight into it with Katharina and Stefan, asking maybe to start with Stefan on why does ethics matter in transdisciplinary and transformative research and practice?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for the kind introduction. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm located here at the Center for Life Ethics. I'm not a trained ethicist or philosopher, but I aspire to be one. So one of the nice things about being able to infiltrate the world of ethics and learn from many of my colleagues is that it kind of has been the moment to step back and say, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about ethics in the context of science? And from the perspective that we've kind of taken at our center, there's kind of three areas where that becomes meaningful or a little bit more tangible. And the first one is basically, how do we arrive at our scientific conclusion? So it's basically the methodological dimension of ethics. Say how do we justify that we come to a scientific conclusion using our methodologies? And then there's the ethics of how we apply methods, how do we use concepts and design our research, et cetera. And that's a little bit distinct from what I would then call the second one, which is research integrity. So this is more of what you might think of as the classic research ethics, right? So you have to get your research approved by an ethical review board. And this is really about, like, how can we have kind of external checks and balances for scientific integrity, that we're not causing any harm, et cetera, in the approaches that we're taking. And then there's kind of this third one, which is perhaps where we might land, and there's a lot of debate there. And this is this kind of like philosophical or theoretical assumption. So this is about ontologies, worldviews, and epistemic dimensions of ethics. Like, what is the right way to do research? What is the types of questions that we should ask, and what should be the purpose and ambition of doing research in this way? And I think it's important to distinguish between these areas when we're talking about ethics, just so we're clear which part we're talking about in any given part of the conversation. So is it about research integrity? Is it about methods? Or is it about kind of the purpose of the research in these broader reflections?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very useful distinction to make, and also to see how this then fits to our follow-up conversation that we're going to be having. Katharina, if I may invite you to the conversation, why do you think research ethics matters for transdisciplinary research?
Well, first of all, I am an ethicist by training, so of course I would say ethics always matters, particularly the philosophical dimensions. But if we, Stefan mentioned that already, if we look at classic research ethics, then we usually have the purpose. Sorry, there's a background noise somewhere. Someone could mute themselves. That would be nice. So so the classic research ethics has basically two functions. One is indeed protecting the integrity of research, of the scientific system. Also, on the other is to prevent harm. And it has been historically very much introduced in reaction also to concrete harms caused in medical experimentations, in concentration camps, to give the most extreme example. So learning from this experience, standards have been introduced. But of course, these standards sometimes need revision and have to be discussed. And I think transdisciplinary and transformative research comes with different and new and sometimes maybe more subtle ethical challenges and normative questions, which are about respect and equity, reciprocity in the research process, about epistemic inclusion, different levels and different types of knowledge that come into dialogue. Conflicting norms and normative views and values that can also clash in the participatory process. And of course, you mentioned, or Elaine also mentioned, that it's also about this purpose of doing good with research, which is growing, this idea. And then, of course, we also need to discuss what is good and what are the normative assumptions and goals that we want to achieve here.
Yeah, so it's also about values basically that are underlying it, and I think Stefan has a lot to say about that as well.
Well, just to follow up to Katarina's point, and maybe it's a bit of repetition, but one of the core things that's been learning for me is that the way ethicists would view ethics is that they're involved in every human action. And if you take that over into science, that all the choices that we make in the scientific process, including the concepts we use, the methodologies, who we're going to collaborate with, the types of topics we're going to focus on, those have value, if not only implicitly or some kind of subconscious values behind why we make the choices in there, whether that's related to discipline, or it's related to your academic field or your problem orientation, et cetera. So if we can start to see that all the choices that we make within our research projects have at least implicit value behind them, and we can try to make those more explicit and discuss them more openly about why we might make those choices, I think then we're starting to get into a little bit more depth on the ethical challenges of this type of research.
Yeah, so not only taking them on autopilot, but being explicit around them and also being able to explicate them. Yeah. You would to add something, Stefan?
Well, I think the transparency, I think, is an important part that we discussed. So it's about first building that awareness, and that's the terminology we use in the paper that you referenced earlier. That if we can build this awareness and create more transparency about that, and even have the self-reflective capacity, then at least it brings it to the surface, which allows it to be seen by others why we made those choices, to describe and use better vocabulary for why we made certain decisions, and allow us to discuss them in open formats a bit more.
Yeah, thank you. So when we stick a bit with this idea of values and how they underpin our research, I was wondering maybe, Katarina, whether you can bring that into practice for us. Do you have a practical example of how that works for your own research?
Yeah, well, I have a practical example from my own experience and my own research that I could introduce to you. So we were working with a group on a project about robots in elderly care, in particular social robots, and how they are introduced. And our question was how this might challenge the idea of good care, and also the relationships of the caregivers with their patients, and their self view also as caregivers, what that means to them, their identity. And we started with having a conversation with people working at an elderly care facility. And then, well, of course, we somehow assumed that we come with a more or less neutral position. But in this conversation, it became very quickly clear how much we had this normative assumption that, well, let's say the bed robots are disruptive, and that they are taking away the warmth and the caring relationship and the human touch and this immediate human relationship, while the people working there had completely different questions and issues, like they very pragmatic approach that everything that helps them make their work easier, which is very hard and under conditions of scarcity, very difficult these days. They were happy with any kind of help. they were rather concerned that all these robots don't really help in practice. And at the same time, they were concerned about us as researchers coming in and even disrupting their practices even more. So they said, of course, you can come, you can observe what we are doing, but then please also help serving coffee and playing bingo with the people here. They always love students being around and so on. So, and this demands a different type of flexibility and on the one hand, questioning your own normative assumptions and even the question that you come with. And at the same time being flexible also in the way you in our self-understanding as researchers, that was much more questioned at the end than their self-understanding as caregivers, which was very interesting. So also this entanglement of the methodological and the normative, and also well, maybe the ontological assumptions that we had too.
Yeah, so what surfaces there is also that it very much comes in this interaction that you're having in transdisciplinary research with the other, or with the others, is that you're getting a mirroring of what it is that what are these own values that you might not even be aware of to that extent, and how they're influencing how you go and interact with everybody. Yeah,
exactly. And that seeing them as others, others is again already a normative stance that we take. So there are a lot of layers, and I think ethics, or also professional ethics and philosophical ethics, can then help, as Stefan also said, to make that transparent and to show these different strands that come together.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Katharina. May I also invite Stefan to share a bit from your own research context of how these values come in for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely agree that there's different layers, and I'll simplify mine because I have the non-ethicist approach into two layers. And so my background is more in ocean governance and ocean conservation in this area, and for me it's pretty clear that there's kind of a generic or kind of strategic level type of ethics around sustainability and equity, etc. And that's probably similar to a lot of the research that most of us have, that there is some sort of generic ethics. And to say that we wouldn't have that kind of strategic or higher level ethical normative orientation would not necessarily be so honest, I would say, because as we said before, if we take the idea that ethics are in all the actions, there is implicit ethics behind a lot of the decision making that we have. One of the challenges I see with research, though, is that we kind of transform that. We link those ethics into specific strategies in our research, and that we become fixed on that. And I think one example from ocean context is marine protected areas. So you might have a meta ethic of like, well, I want to, environmental sustainability is an approach or an ethic if it comes from environmental ethics. But then we become fixed that one particular way of manifesting that into practice would be through marine protected areas, instead of having a more open and pluralistic view to seeing how that would change or what would be right in different contexts. And that's where I think, at least in my field, there's gotten into trouble, that we have such a strong normative orientation towards something that we become blinded to alternative ways through which we can manifest that in practice. For example, empowering livelihoods, or different types of governance approaches, or integrated human nature approaches, instead of conservation explicitly that excludes people. And so if we have more of a pluralistic and a willingness to understand different types of ethics, it'll inform the different types of approaches that will provide a more rounded toolbox to fit the context we have. And this is what we've seen a lot in my field.
Yeah, it reminds me of the work that Pilke Jr. has been doing on the different roles of researchers, where he's differentiating also between an issue advocate, so focusing on a certain marine protected areas in this context, and puts that next to the honest broker of alternatives, where it's much more about showing those plural pathways that would be there. He puts it very much black and white, but I think there might be arguments and values to also go for one or the other option. But
this type of work is really useful to be self-reflective on your own position, and to see how you carry your own ethics through the process, and how you can be open, I think, to adapting that based on the goals of your research, or the collective goals of, if it's a transdisciplinary, with those who you're doing research with, and to see what is the balance of whose ethics counts, what do we want to achieve here. And again, I think getting back to that, building awareness so that it's transparent, and then when it becomes more transparent, then we can discuss it more openly.
Yeah, great. It brings us to the next point that we wanted to discuss, and that's around what if you're working together and you can't agree, when you have ethical conflicts or ethical dilemmas. And that's something that we focused on in our paper, these kind of dilemmas where you think like, how to decide. And I wanted to ask again, Katharina, to share a bit with us what makes a situation an ethical dilemma rather than just a difficult, decision to be taken in a transdisciplinary research context.
Well, strictly speaking, that it is a dilemma means that there is no better option or no better solution or no clear solution to it. Well, if you look into philosophical discussions, very often these classic ethical dilemma or moral dilemma cases are introduced to show how different norms or values clash, or different moral theories or assumptions and our intuitions clash, or also to discuss the general limits of how far we can go with morality or ethics, how that works. That's Jean-Paul Sartre introduces a case, for instance, to illustrate that and say, well, maybe we just have to make a choice and we cannot really tell what's better. If you look into the literature, many of these cases are very constructed and seems very far off from reality. Because I would say what happens in real life is often more this conflict, so that there are different views that conflict, but somehow maybe you might find a better solution at the end of the day.
Could you maybe give us one of those examples when you say more abstract, so that we have a grasp on it?
From the philosophical literature. Yes, well, maybe a famous one is the trolley problem. I guess many might have heard of that, where in the classic version, you have to make a choice. So you sit in the trolley and the brakes don't work, and you're heading towards a spur with 5 people and will run into them, and on the other there's just one person. And are you allowed to make a choice and switch the tracks and so on? So I don't know how many versions of that. Or to give another example, another classic example is the Heinz dilemma, where someone, his wife is very ill, and the only option that he has is to steal a too expensive drug to save her life, and is he allowed to do so? And you can use these cases to discuss different moral theories. Do you take a utilitarian stance and say it's about overall utility, or is it about the care for this person that counts, or and so on and so on. You can discuss all the different theories with that, and that's very good. I like to use them in education and teaching to look at it from different perspectives. But of course, they are extreme cases and often very constructed. So it's what we face in real life is often much more ambiguous and subtle, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. But they of course provide nice ideal types to discuss the different theories around, right?
Exactly. I would say they're a great training field for ethics.
Yeah. If I could ask Stefan to help us bring this back to our transdisciplinary research context.
Yeah. So I mean, just to add on to what Katharina said, I mean, those ethical, in my view, those kind of thought experiments are useful. Both the examples and a lot of the other examples that I've seen are at the individual level, right? So and I think in practice, it's not always 50-50. Like it's not always one or the other, and it's almost always in the case of doing transdisciplinary research that you're in a larger group of people, and that the likelihood that everyone views what's the ethical right decision across the group as a 50-50 or balanced, or that there's no is unlikely, I would say. And then for me, the question is, well, how do you then go about in group settings discussing collective ethical problems? Like what are the methods that we can use to facilitate that? What are the tools that we can have to better understand people's implicit assumptions and positions? So we've in the paper we published about building ethical awareness, we kind of think about breaking down the transdisciplinary research or co-production research into 4 kind of steps or decision points that people would have to do. And the first one is like basically, what do you like focus on in your research? And the second would be who to include, and then how to do it, and then how to move on, right? So we kind of broke it very simply into these 4 areas and say at each of those steps, you have to make a decision, like a big decision that's part of the research that has an ethical implication. And how do you justify the choice that you made? What problem to focus on, at what scale, which stakeholders to include, how to go about the process of research methodologically, and then how to move forward to make an applied impact, for example.
Yes, great, thanks. And I think we're going to take that these two perspectives now. So one on the more the ethical theories that Katharina already alluded to, as well as these different decision points. And we take the audience along in discussing two actual ethical dilemmas that were shared in the paper that I've been co-authoring, where that came from basically the practice of the researchers that were co-authoring. And what we want to do is reflect with you on these dilemmas before we have space in breakout rooms, where we invite you to also yourself in smaller groups discuss that in a bit more detail and in a more interactive way. And we have two of those. And can I invite Elaine to share the first one with us? Yes. So the dilemma is, basically the question is, what would you do? And the scenario is that a research group was asked by a major oil and gas company if they could support them in their transition. And the mission of this research group being to support sustainability transitions, there was an ongoing, at times first internal debate on whether this group should in general work for oil and gas. One argument being the need to proactively phase out fossil parts of their business models, or help them basically phasing out and transition them towards sustainable alternatives. But in the end, this group decided not to work with the major oil and gas company. But the question kind of remains with the group, if this group could have made a significant change and triggered some small scale transformative change if they had taken on this assignment from the gas and oil company. So can I ask Katharina, with all the ethical theories in her background, to help us make sense of this scenario? What would you do?
Yeah, well, I don't want to go too deep into the rabbit hole of all the theories, but at least give some hints of how they can help, or which questions they would ask to look into this case. And I think, well, one question that is already somehow explicit there is the question of utility, or maximizing utility or overall well-being, which would be an utilitarian approach then. And this is then how somehow this idea, well, maybe we have to work with the industry, we have to bite the bullet, because it's the best we can do to foster sustainability at the end, which would also be, for instance, the argument of the effective altruism movement, that you have to do whatever you can in which way ever to support this, or the good. But of course, you can ask other questions too, and the researchers also seem to ask a question about their own integrity here. What does this do with us, and can we somehow really integrate this into our own value system, or how does this affect ourselves, our character, if we do that, which would more be a classic virtue ethical perspective that one could use. One could even try to apply somehow a version of the categorical imperative by Kant. So if there are any Kantians here, please bear with me, because it's just a variation of it, which would then mean, so what if everybody would act upon the maxim that you might collaborate with these industries to help them transition? So somehow one could say, if you universalize this supports the system, the stability of the system, and this is a way you maybe should not do it. So there are different questions with which you approach the scenario, I would say, that can come from these different theories.
Yeah, so they can help us enlighten different aspects thereof, and help us take that into account in deciding on how to continue or what to do. Can I ask Stefan to reflect on it in the light of the decision points that you have been introducing earlier?
Yeah, well, I mean, it reminds me back to like the first three categories that I spoke about beginning. Like, so remember the methodological dimension of ethics, and then the research integrity, and then the epistemic or theoretical question. So here, I think there's a methodological, like, so here it's almost implied that it's not fully transdisciplinary in choosing the category, because the researchers are getting to decide and not having an inclusive process with the different stakeholders. So it's like where this is like the ethics of transdisciplinary methods. Like, how do we come to conclusions as transdisciplinary research? Where do researchers have the power to make choices? Where do the other stakeholders who are involved have the power to make choices, et cetera? Yeah, I mean, the way we look at it in our paper is we pick 4 of the major ethical theories along those 4 decision points. Katharina mentioned 2 of them, I believe. So we have consequentialism, or just utilitarian thinking, where it's kind of like only the maximum consequences count, right? And versus deontological or Kantian, where it's like, well, you have a moral duty to follow a certain way regardless of the consequences. In this case, maybe, well, we have a moral duty not to work with the oil companies, even though would be way to maximize the consequences. The other two that we look at are virtue ethics and contractualism. So virtue ethics, in my basic knowledge, is kind of trusting people to do the right thing at the right time, right? So it's kind of putting it back to the actors who were involved and saying, well, they can make a good assessment about what the right thing will do, and the different actors will do that. And here you might say, well, the oil company, maybe they're being virtuous. They're like, well, we want to transition to renewable energy. We want to work with science finally, after all the years, to do that. And maybe from this perspective, it's good. The other is contractualist approaches, where the claim there is more that the most ethical thing to do would be to agree. And what is agreed on as ethically good is then the approach that would go forward. And so at which steps in this scenario would at each ethical theory come into play in terms of justifying the choices that are made?
So this approach that you're taking also highlights that you don't need to choose one and stick with it. Rather, it is about taking all of these different theories into account to make an informed decision at each of these decision points, right?
That's the example that we give in the paper. So we give two examples where he said, well, it also doesn't necessarily make sense that I would pick one throughout the whole process, because there might be different ethical implications or different people involved, depending on the methodological dimensions of the project. And we might actually make different decisions with different ethical justifications at each step. And here, as you saw in the figure we have from the paper, we highlight the two projects that kind of bounce between the ethics of the different choices, and then we give examples of what that actually mean in practice for those projects.
Great, thanks for sharing. Let's move to the second dilemma. Yes, there it is, the second scenario. I'm going to start reading again. In the research collaboration, so we, that's the research team, encountered tremendous challenges in defining who are those migrants and or displaced populations impacted by climate change. Our study participants do not recognize themselves as vulnerable population affected by climate change, nor climate migrants or even climate refugees. However, for the sake of awareness raising and political campaign, the research team was asked by the funder to name this population as climate displaced persons. Are we doing more harm to the local people and communities, e.g., or for example, entrenching a sense of otherness and reinforcing negative stereotypes by labeling them as vulnerable, marginalized, or migrants for research and political purposes? And I think many of us have been encountering such questions around the ontological questions of how to approach and how to name. So I wonder, Katharina, if I can give you the floor first, what would you do?
Well, again, I won't say what I would do, but what the theories can bring, I would say. Again, one could use a very classic approach and say what a principle that is also already mentioned is somehow the non-harm principle, and some would say this is one of the really basic principle of ethics, maybe a universal one, that you should try to avoid harm other parties. But of course, then you can, again, like a bit in the other case, you can make this consideration whether the end justifies the means. So it's also mentioned here that they want to do campaigning and raising political awareness. So maybe the harm that is caused is not that relevant then in relation to that. So then it would be some kind of a weighing model of that. But I think in this case nicely shows that there might also be other perspectives that are very relevant here, which is then could be a perspective of care ethics, which is then more about the relational aspects. So which duties of care do we have, or relationships do we have with the people there, and how about their self-view and their self-determination, and what there are questions of power structures that also play a role. Then what gives us the authority to label them in a certain way if they do not claim that for themselves, or do not see them, or maybe also do not want to be seen as objects of research in this specific case.
Thank you, Katharina. It also reminds me, like, no harm, also from which perspective and at which point in time. I see the comment in the chat saying, yes, we actually need more information to assess these kind of scenarios, right? But this is an invitation to also think, like, what is the kind of information needed to do this kind of reflection in a different way. But also, like, when you see the no harm, at which point in time, right? When you go back how does that change also over time? I would say it would be interesting to see. Stefan, can I invite you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is kind of the starting point for our paper in the sense that I might have an intuition about what I would do, right? But I don't really have a toolbox, at least from a non-ethical philosophy training background, that can provide some rigorous, scientifically examined theoretical basis for that decision. I might have an intuition about my normative values. Then I would ask like those in the session here to reflect. You might have an intuition about what you would do in this scenario. How would you justify it? Do you have a toolbox of different ethical theories, for example, from philosophy or from ethics to help you support your decision in a rigorous academic way? And I think that's where a lot of the field of sustainability, most broadly, kind of is lacking right now, is that we often claim to be interdisciplinary, but one of the disciplines that we often fail to include is philosophy and ethics, which has a very long history of trying to understand what morally good decision making are in relation to human actions. And that's what we try to say here. It's not what is the right thing to do, but whatever conclusion that we come to, how can we justify that as morally good based on academic theory and concepts which already exist from these different fields which have been around for a while. And I think if we can build up that toolbox of justifications, then we can make better arguments ourselves in our research for that. Why do we want to have an equity-based approach in this case and a justice approach based in this one? Why do we want to have an inclusive and participatory approach? You might intuitively think those are good, but not have the theoretical arguments that support that based on the literature and philosophy that would be interdisciplinary to link those concepts into our work. So I think if we can shift the needle towards interdisciplinarity and into ethics and philosophy, this is going to really help support and make our arguments in the field of sustainability a lot more well-grounded.
I like your plaidoyer, I don't know whether it's an English word, for bringing more philosophy into this interdisciplinary field, which I think is really needed. I also saw Katarina nodding.
Yeah, may I very briefly follow up to this, because yes, of course I agree, but also to clarify this, I think very often people have the expectation that then the ethicist says, well, you should do this or you should do that, and that's the solution. But it's one of my favorite quotes of Simone de Beauvoir in her Ethics of Ambiguity. There she says that ethics doesn't really provide recipes, so it does not say do this or do that, but the methods to reflect on it and ask the questions which are then relevant for the specific situation. And because this was mentioned in the chat, and indeed then often you need much more information and the different perspectives of the people who are involved to really take a decision at the end.
Yeah, and one of those methods is, I think, what Stefan provided with the 4 decision points, could be one of those methods to actually do the reflection in a different way.
Yeah, I would invite, if I may just add one thing onto that, Julia. So again, to reiterating a bit, but we use so many normative concepts, even things like conservation, sustainability itself. Next time that you use one of those in your writing, think about like from the perspective of transdisciplinary, like who's deciding that this is the right approach in this context, and what is my theoretical basis for supporting that this approach is the right one compared to a different one. And I think in sustainability, we've kind of gotten lost in a little bit of a normative soup of it's become so normalized to use these normative concepts, but not as at least in our writing, to really explain the foundations for why we think those are morally better or good in these different contexts, and the choices and the reason why we made that and chose those normative concepts and not other ones.
Yeah, so I wonder, you say it becomes kind of normalized. We got so used to these kind of concepts that we don't see the normative soup around them anymore. And I think that's exactly what happens in lots of mainstream research as well, right? Like there's a lot of concepts being used and ideas that are so normalized that we don't even think about them anymore. And we are in sustainability context or sustainability or justice questions. Many of us are still aware of it, but it becomes already to the point that also that is being normalized, and we stop thinking about why we use the concepts that we use. I think I would like to take the question that we raised about what would you do, plus the question that Stefan said, how would you justify that? And ask the audience to join us in this discussion. And we want to do that by doing the number of breakout rooms. So Elaine is preparing them. And our invitation would be to discuss one of the two scenarios. So pick one so you have enough time to go a bit more depth. Like, what would you do and how would you justify it? Even if you don't know the name of the ethical theory yet, that could be the homework. But just see, like, what's your justification? And then maybe there's others in the group that can help you sharpen this as well. But also, you could think about own dilemmas. So you could also say, one of in the group says, I have this dilemma, I would like to explore a bit more with you. Go and we do kind of peer support and peer intermediation. There is a Miro board also that Elaine organized.
I'll share that when we're in the
Come again?
I will share that when we're in the breakout group.
Yeah, so she will share that in a bit. And there you could also just add your dilemmas if you would like to share that, or formulate a question for further discussion. So we want you to either discuss one of the dilemmas that we shared, or come up with your own dilemma and discuss that a bit. What would you do? How would you justify it to help you sharpen your repertoire? And come back with at least one question per group that we can then put in a chat and then continue the discussion with. Yes, I gonna invite Elaine then to help us navigate the breakout rooms. I would like to again invite Katharina and Stefan. You have also been in groups. Are there any question or discussion or justification that you were discussing that you would like to share with the plenary now? Katharina or Stefan? I see. Oh yeah, both of you are highlighted. So, who would like to go first?
Yeah, I could start. We at the very end we had the question that how do we kind of improve the conversation about ethics between different disciplines. I think that's how it was kind of distilled down to. And I think that's a great starting point. Like, just the question is the answer. Like, we need to improve the conversation. We need to talk more about it and bring it to the level where we recognize our own assumptions in our research. I think the example that was given in our group was kind of, some sciences think they're more neutral or objective, and it's just, there is no value orientation, and some are very explicit about that. And again, if we take that perspective that all actions have some implicit ethical values behind them, then we could say it's within science, like it's not bad. This is just what science is. We all have values. It doesn't erode the scientific integrity. In fact, it increases it when we can be transparent about the ethics and discuss it more openly about the biases that it might lead to, or the types of choices and theories and concepts that we use. And bringing different people into conversation is always challenging. Probably a lot of us have been in interdisciplinary groups, but we're still in as much as we've, been thinking about interdisciplinarity in a lot of the different sciences for many decades, I think it's still a lot of work to be done. Like, there's a lot of disciplines that aren't very well integrated, like humanities or like philosophy, and connections. We're good between some disciplines and not so good at others, and it's still really difficult in practice. And still, our scientific institutions are designed around disciplines and not around problems and faculties and stuff. So I think keep in mind that this still needs a lot of work, and coming into conversation is I think always a great starting point.
Yeah, I'm going to pick 2 points. One is the fear that I hear you're talking about. This fear of maybe failure, of saying something that of showing parts of yourself that are not perfect. Fear of showing you're not objective, neutral, if that is what is standard in your discipline. So I think there's something around that we might want to pick up on later. And the other one is the institutional context and what those do with us in thinking about ethical reflections. But before I go there, first want to ask Katharina what she brings, and then we'll continue the discussion. Yeah, thank you, Stefan.
I think partly where I had a similar point, also this question of creating a discussion culture, also spaces for conflict. We also talked about opposing political views, for instance, and how to work with people whose political convictions you do not share or don't want to support, and the room for agonistic spaces, but also the fact that we bring people together at a table that can already be good and helpful. We talked about the general question how to disentangle political and ethical questions. I would say very often it's not really possible, and they are just intertwined. And also about well, the normative goals that we bring somehow from a top-down perspective, and the concrete problems that people have from a bottom-up perspective, which they would not define as, for instance, created through climate change, or do not see like that. But maybe we have a different perspective on that, and then shall we again label it like this, or how can we approach this? This was one of the questions that we were still struggling with at the end.
Can I pick out the one on, because you glossed a bit over it, but it was also one in the chat. It is like political worth is it a political question or is it an ethical question? Maybe you can help us a bit on what is it that you discussed there, but also what's your opinion on this? How does that flow into each other?
Well, personally, I would say it's indeed very difficult to distinguish. One could say that the ethical questions are more on a, let's say, interpersonal, relational level, and the political then more on a systemic, societal level. So this could be one approach, and one could also say that in politics, this is something that we talked about briefly, you might need dirty hands, while in ethics you try not to do so. So this is then also a difference somehow how the game is played, and what the normative standards are, how high they are. But indeed, I would say that in particular in this transformative research and also participatory research, because you are interacting with so many different parties, literally, it is often very political, and these power dynamics and relationships play a very important role. And it's not just this one-to-one relationship that we often assume in discussions about ethics or ethical problems.
Yeah. And maybe reflecting on what we discussed now was very much also on this interface. That's why I also wanted to pick it out again. It was on this question of self-identification, climate displaced people or not. This was the example that we showed, but we were discussing it around the category of indigenous people, and it carries, of course, ethical and normative, has connotations, but also a political aspect to it. And the question of who would like to use the label or not, and who is being able to put that label onto others or not, and what's the discussions and decisions behind that, justifications, basically, as Stefan put. So that's where ethical and political go kind of together, very entangled on that question. Stefan, can I reflect that back to you? Because I think when Katharina says it's about staying away from getting our hands dirty, I was thinking about how you basically say it's around everything is a decision. You have to take it in the actual context, right? That's a bit of what I read in your paper. It's about this contextualized. You have the ethical theories, which kind of stay a bit at the abstract level. But when you are contextualized doing this kind of research, that's when you get your hands dirty, is it?
Yeah.
Maybe I misinterpret.
No, that's perfectly good reflection on it. I mean, what you said a bit earlier is like, how is, I think it's a little bit about the fears, right? It's like, how is, like, at a societal level, like, politics is normative and science is objective. And we have this, I think, challenge that we want to kind of at the same time admit and show that we have values in our research and that those are important features without undermining the public interpretation of scientific integrity. And I think this is a big tension, like at the science-society interface, but it also exists within science, that different disciplines have different positions on that, and have different stances about like what is good science, what methods, etc. And if you're coming into that as an early career researcher, being first aware that kind of tensions exist, and then it's kind of how do you navigate in that, I think is tricky. And I think we still have, as a transformations and like transdisciplinary community, like, I think, to be honest, like, I'm not totally convinced that our field has really good justifications for why our value-oriented research still meets good scientific integrity. I think a lot of the papers we see written, they still lack the kind of justification that, like, yeah, we had a value-oriented approach, but yet still, this is why it's still really good. research that has integrity and the conclusions are valid and it meets the methodological ethics. We explain the ontological dimensions, and we're checking all the boxes. I think we still need to do better about thinking about what those arguments are in this different contexts. Yeah. In our discussion group about getting the hands dirty, there's no, there's a critique like, well, one ethical theory might be better in different contexts. And on our paper, we don't say that those are the 4 theories that are the best ones. It's just that we tried to pick the maximum different ones, and in any given context, the justifications are going to be different even across the project. So I think, we can't really talk about ethics until we get to those real contexts. And that's where I think ethics has a huge application to be applied, despite maybe its reputation as being kind of a desk-based type of scientific discipline.
Yes, thank you. There's this, both of you said that it's around needing to improve the conversation. Do you have good examples of how this happens already, or do you have ideas on how this could be done differently?
I have an example, because we have a colleague here who's running a project called Pluriversal Dialogues. And the whole point of it is to bring different groups who have different ontological positions, kind of maximum ethical differences, one could say, about how the world, more from traditional science, engineering, but also working with indigenous groups in different parts of South America, Western scholars from different parts of the world, et cetera. And the whole purpose of the project is to say, well, we come from these maximally different starting points, and we want to bring them into dialogue and try to, and each of us at different points during the projects, try to place yourself into the ethical context of the other person. Of course, after getting a bit of introduction to it and a bit of the background and stuff, and try to be that in dialogue from that person's perspective, and kind of rotate, come into exchange, have different types of workshops, activities. And just, again, I think it's that awareness that those other perspectives exist, and try to take it seriously, that those are actually perspectives that guide large groups of people, entire cultures, entire scientific disciplines that come literally from a different perspective. And I think we're not good enough at practicing these types of engagement methods that really place us in that situation of other people.
There's this question on whether you could repeat the name. Is it Pluriversal Dialogues? Yes. Okay. Oh yeah, we have a question, a point made by Stefan. We want to acknowledge that we have values guiding our research, but we don't want to undermine the scientific integrity of our work in the eyes of society. Okay, so you said that. And then in the US right now, there's widely used argument made by Republican Party that the educational institutions have been captured by and reproduce liberal party values. Do you have an idea on how we could address that?
Not too. I do. I am a U.S. American in my former life, I guess. Every political party has values, right? I mean, it gets back to that thing. It's like everyone has different values. It depends on how they argue, and it depends on what the implications of those are. And at least in the context of a lot of the politics where you have divides, it's just coming into dialogue again. I think you can apply the same methods and challenges you have in research. And to how do we minimize the conflict, get into dialogue, have facilitated dialogue, try to understand, put yourself in the position of the other. I think it's not just in the US, but in a lot of other places in the world, this would be beneficial.
Yeah. Yes, we're getting into discussion. Blaine, come in.
Thanks. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether it was appropriate at this stage or not, but I figured I'd
Try.
shoot my shot. So I really appreciate this kind of this shift towards a conversation, like, or prompting on it's about having better conversations. And I think just sharing from kind of my own experience, and I think this is what like an important one for this community, is to think about what those conversations look like in the specific context of transdisciplinary and inter and transdisciplinary research and transformations research, or TDTR, or whatever we call it. Insofar as how we often sort of look at, and I think Stefan already alluded to this, sort of like the notion of sort of mixing disciplines and bringing disciplines together as a normative good in terms of trying to further some of these things. But I think a deeper question is like, what role or where are they being brought in to the sort of the sense-making process. Speaking as a social scientist who works a lot with natural scientists, there's a strong tendency that I've observed to bring social science into like complement or complete pictures that have been established on the basis of questions that have been posed and articulated through the natural sciences around something like the climate crisis. And I think what that doesn't enable us to do necessarily is to start from the starting point of these kind of deeper questions of ethics or kind of incommensurabilities between kind of what we understand the problem to be or what we understand good work to look like, because we've kind of we're bringing those in on top of a foundation that's already been laid. And so perhaps a bigger question that we may need to explore as a community is to sort of say, like, what do those partnerships look like across stages of evolution of kind of problem building or context setting problem building, methods choosing, and kind of research and change enacting, and how do sort of different, if you will, kind of disciplinary and knowledge kind of traditions bring different critical components like at those different stages. I'm not sure how much I've seen that kind of unpacks that across the sort of like, if you will, the knowledge making lifespan of a research endeavor. So I think that to cast sort of this tendency to cast kind of like, as long as we've got these different actors kind of at the table, then these good things can come from it if it's well facilitated. Being a bit more granular, I think, can ask us like whether we've kind of missed key decision points for bringing that knowledge to bear on the foundations of problems that we're trying to pose. Maybe that's convoluted kind of. I don't know. I don't know if it's a question or just a response to that, to what's been raised so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Blaine. I think I saw Katarina nodding quite a bit, so maybe she wants to reflect on this.
Yeah, well, it made me think of the role that ethics often gets in large project applications or research projects, which is done at the end to make sure that we tick the boxes and say, okay, we give approval for what the scientists are already doing. And I would say, on the one hand, this is something where we also have to, well, think about the whole academic system and the funding system and so on, how this might have to be changed, which is still very much in many respects based on a scientific natural science perspective, I would say, and the standards used there. And at the same time, what I see as a good development is that it's the early career researchers who are asking for the discussions, because they are somehow, on the one hand, already see it as something natural to do this transdisciplinary thing, or as you said, it's good to bring people together at the table without, but at the same time they feel that it needs more reflection. At least is my impression. It needs more discussion. Why are we actually doing? How do we do this in a good way? How do we really combine the disciplines? And this also needs strong disciplines, I would say, and strong knowledge in the different fields to make sure that they can really get into a good conversation and bring in their strength. And another point is that we should already try to integrate this in the education as soon as possible of future researchers, I would say.
Yeah. I can I see that point of many early career researchers. They're trying to make sense of the context within which they are doing their research. While being new to that context, they just have different questions, and I think that's really helping also to keep us as educators sharp on what it is that is actually strange about the context that we're living in. Right? It's kind of giving this mirroring again of how the context works. I want to build a bit upon this question really on how to keep that conversation going, or how to improve the conversation. So we had this one really nice example that Stefan shared from this project, pluriversal dialogues. Is there any other that you have? Maybe also the audience can think about it, because I would be interested to hear a bit more on that, on how this is being done also in different contexts. I think I have myself a very small example, while you might think about other examples, and that is on when I do this large-scale often European funded research projects, I'm trying to smuggle in this task that is on inter-transdisciplinary dialogue, I call it. And it basically gives us the space, the time, and the resources to question the categories that we're working with, how they mean and what they mean in different disciplines, why we use them, if we use them, for which contexts we use them. And just to create that space and the legitimacy for all of us to engage in those dialogues. And also some of the, maybe pressure, because some people I just don't like so much to actually rethink that, or are not accustomed to it maybe so much than SSH researcher, for example. Are there any other examples that you can share from yours?
I just had a reflection before anyone else wants to jump in. I mean, one is just on Blaine's point before that. Yeah. I think at the basis of a lot of our scientific integrity ethics is transparency. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to, that says, I mean, one of the most fundamental principles, you have to just try to be transparent about what you did so that other people can understand it and then make their own evaluation about it, right? If we don't tell them what we did at all the decision points and it's not clear at some point why you made a choice, methodological, conceptual, empirical, analytical, then it's really hard for other people to understand and break that down. So I think remembering and in ethics about the values behind the decisions, I think is part of the transparency and methods. The other point is, like, when we're thinking about what can we do to continue, I would see it kind of at 3 levels. Like at the individual level, what can I do? Like just as me, and then what can I do? The next would be within the project. And the next would be like within the context of your institute or your department, whatever meaningful academic unit there. And then those might be different things. So I would encourage to reflect at those 3.
Yeah, but on the individual, on the department.
Project, yeah.
Project.
Individual, project, and then at the institute or department.
Yeah. I would add the academic system or the broader community, maybe.
Yes.
Beyond that,
of course.
if we could add that. Yeah. Has anybody reflection on that? We're just opening up, basically, as well. I'd be interested to hear. I want to go back to to this question around the scientific integrity and the value-based approach and how to bring that together. It keeps on bothering me a bit. In terms of when you, for example, looking, I'm not sure about other countries, but in the Netherlands, there's a code of integrity that has to be signed by every researcher that is employed at the Dutch university. And one of the principles of this code is independence, basically. And it is around the fact that you basically say that you're not going to have your research agenda, your research questions, your methodology being created by anybody else than yourself. And you're basically signing this, which is, when you think about how much transdisciplinary research is going about, it starts with the calls that are based in policy language, but it also continues with when you start forming those consortia and starting around thinking, what are then these research problems and research questions that you're going to be working upon? And then the question is this actually the scientific integrity code that are you still living it? Or is it just being something that's not of this time anymore when we're doing transdisciplinary research? So I would be curious to hear whether anybody has a reflection on this or knows that kind of dilemma from their own background. Maybe it's also an invitation for Stefan and Katharina to come up with a last round of reflections on our discussions before we close it, because I see that Elaine's getting us towards the end of it.
Well, I love the example. I think it's also some of the examples you highlight in your paper as well, about how when we do this type of research, we run into traditional type of barriers for measuring scientific integrity and thinking what scientific integrity is. One thing that I would think is useful research to be done, if maybe someone would be interested, maybe build a bit on Bruce's point, is like, what are the different arguments that we as a community are putting forward to justify this, right? What are the different pathways that transformative for which transformative research then runs into traditional scientific integrity problems, and what are the arguments that we as a community are kind of making to still validate that integrity while still being transparent and honest about our normative commitments. My guess is there's a lot of people, quite a few different perspectives on that, and then examples, specific examples, like in Bruce's case, like, well, when I did this policy brief project with this group, like I had to think about this, and this is what I thought about, and this is the reaction to it, and this is what in the end, what was learned from it, and having this would, I think, would be really valuable if it doesn't already exist.
I haven't heard of it, but I would want to read it if it's there. Thank you very much for your reflections, Stefan. Katharina.
Yeah, what I thought about is that I think it was already mentioned that one important thing is to take different perspectives, also when it comes to ethical disagreement. And at the same time, I would say it's also with this independency and neutrality questions, it's also an exercise in sometimes taking a step back and trying to take this independent and neutral position, keep the overview of what is going on, and at the same time, the committed and engaged perspective where you also work together with partners and try to do this on eye level, being aware that you have the privilege that you bring. And I think this constant exercise and being aware of your perspective, changing your perspectives, stepping back and forward and into the shoes of others is something that we have to really practice together and reflect about together. How can we improve this? And I think you cannot really completely institutionalize this. Maybe you can institutionalize the structures that you need to do so and the support that you need to do so and the time. I like that, Julia, from your example that you said you try to bring this into the research project, that the time is taken to reflect on this. And someone else mentioned that too. It's so great that we have the time to talk about these issues. And this is also something that we desperately need as researchers, I guess, and don't have, but that can be a structural point.
To take up, yeah,
to give time for that we don't have at the moment, I would say.
I hear you saying like continuous challenge yourself, and I think it ties nicely too with what Stefan said around aiming for the plural pathways, right? Not staying with marine, I don't know, protected areas was the example he gave, but what's the other plural pathways we could go for? So challenge ourselves in our normative frameworks. I think that's a nice kind of closing word. If Stefan doesn't want to come in because it looked like it, no. Okay. Then I think I head back to Elaine. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Katharina and Stefan, especially.